everyone, and welcome to our weekly research seminar for the School of Humanities. Today we have, I don't think it's quite right to say visiting us. It's a chance for us to welcome back Jan-Piet Knijff, who now is attached to the University of Kentucky in America, where he is undertaking further study in Latin, particularly in the area that he is going to be talking about to us on the question of spoken Latin. But many of you will know Jan-Piet from other contexts as well. He was appointed here to teach music and musicology in the university, having... Pardon? Sorry. Sounds like she's going to introduce himself. Having already achieved very highly both in his native Holland and also in America. Many of you will know that he won an international organ competition at Lausanne quite some years ago. He completed a PhD in America and had undertaken various degrees in Holland, Utrecht and elsewhere. But he came to us with already a very established interest and, I have to say, a real level of expertise in Latin and Greek. And so, on the fly, Jan-Piet offered to help with teaching some Greek and Latin for us in 2011, which was a very great help because it allowed me to get away for a little while. So, Jan-Piet, it's wonderful to have you back here. I'm just sorry that Brigitte is not able to be back with you at the moment. She's still in America. But Jan-Piet is going to speak to us about Who Said Latin's Dead, active Latin in the classroom and beyond. So please do welcome our good friend.
Thank you very much for the elegant introduction. Thank you for having me here today. I was going to make all kinds of jokes, but maybe I won't. So yeah, who said Latin is dead? Well, lots of people say Latin is dead all the time, right? And depending on your point of view, you can like that, or you can get upset about it, or something in the middle. The question, of course, is always the definition of dead in this case. What does that actually mean, that a language is dead? And I mean, people have written very complex and extensive books about this, and I really don't want to go into this today, but I'll say a number of things about it. My main interest is really to say something about active use of Latin, both written and spoken. I have become a firm believer in this concept from an intellectual point of view, if you will, from an academic point of view, if you even will. But most of all, I think it's so much fun. And maybe even more than that, I have now so frequently seen over quite a few years now how active use of the language makes teaching and learning Latin so much more fun. And I hasten to add, much more effective in my point of view. So who said Latin is dead? Active Latin in the classroom, but I think the classroom alone is not really enough. If you want to sort of take this seriously, you have to take it a little bit out of the classroom. I'll say a little bit of that as well. I'm attached to the University of Kentucky somewhat loosely. I will be a graduate assistant there this coming year, teaching Latin and maybe other things. And of course, I'm working on an advanced degree in classics at the university, not just Latin, also Greek. Although we don't speak much Greek, unfortunately. Some people do, but we don't quite do that yet there. The first question, I think, is why study Latin at all? In America, the big thing why study Latin, is the answer is it helps you with your SATs. SAT scores is some kind of high school exam score thing, and apparently statistics show that Latin make your SAT scores, your high school finishing level, stronger. It makes you more intelligent, it seems. But I'm not quite sure that it's a good way to get people doing it. All right? But that's one reason. Here are a few other reasons. Well, placet, immo magnum est gaudium, it's a lot of fun. That's one reason. I think always the best thing to do anything, all right? But then, the traditional reason for learning Latin is number 2a. Virgil, Catullus, Ovid, Cicero, Tacitus, and Horace. You can add at will to these. I think these are maybe the 5 most commonly read, studied classical authors, and maybe in order of interest. We can discuss this, as I'm sure, at length, but certainly in America, and I think maybe also in Australia, to an extent in Europe, Virgil is, if there's one reason why you study Latin, it's Virgil. After that, I think Catullus, Ovid somewhere on the way, Cicero, if you get far enough to understand him, Tacitus, if you get even further, and Horace, if you really, really, really know Latin, and you want to suffer through analyzing complex poetry, all right? 2b is, I think, very, very important, and usually not taken seriously, although increasingly it is taken seriously, both in Europe and also more increasingly in America. Erasmus, I'm very, very proud of being a compatriot of this, one of the greatest Latin writers of all time, right? Erasmus of Rotterdam, Thomas More, John Barclay, a very, very fine Latin writer from the early 17th century in England, who wrote this novel, right, in Latin. Here's who writes Latin novels. Argenis, and like a 600-700 page Latin novel. It's all in 1620. How good can it be? And how many people would have read that, right? Well, very quickly, it's incredibly good. It's very, very fine Latin, highly original Latin as well. And how many people read it? Well, I don't quite know, but I can tell you that the book went through 55 editions in the 17th century alone. It was also, by the way, Leibniz's favorite book. That leads me to 2c, Kepler, Leibniz, and Cartesius, scholarly use of Latin in the Renaissance and later. In summary, contrary to ancient Greek, one, in my view, big reason to learn Latin is that it's your passport to European history, right? This study of Neo-Latin literature, Erasmus, More, Barclay, Holberg, 18th century, very fine Latin novel, and also the scholarly Latin, is something that is becoming quite popular now in Europe, and also at Kentucky we try to do that more and more. And this is also something that very nicely links in with speaking the language. Erasmus and Thomas More communicated in Latin all the time. Erasmus spoke Latin with the kiddies more. 12-year-old, what's her name, Margaret or something, spoke Latin with Uncle Erasmus. All right? And that was their only common language. Of course, Erasmus didn't speak English. You must be joking. Much less did the Moors speak Dutch. You've got to be joking even more, right? But Latin, that was it. So we feel in Kentucky that this is a very nice combination. Now, why speak Latin? Van Maxime Plaken. It's a lot of fun, believe it or not. Number 2, pedagogical reason. I go into this a bit more. And number 3, saving an endangered species. A threatened language, an endangered species. Number 1, it's fun. And this is what a professor of mine said a while ago. I keep it anonymous because he was worried to get a little bit in trouble if you made it too public. But if you really love a language, you want to not only decipher it and study it, but you want to speak it, right? The pedagogical reasons, in America, I'm not quite sure about here, but in America, both public schools and private schools, Latin is doing quite okay. All right, it's not so badly off as it used to be. it's usually now considered simply another language. And the fancy use name the Americans use for the language department in a high school is usually the world language department, world language. And Latin is just another world language. You can study French, maybe Italian, maybe German, maybe Spanish, often Spanish in America, Japanese, Mandarin, or Latin. It's just another one. That, I think, is in many ways incredibly positive, because it encourages Latin teachers to do the exact same thing, to use the same pedagogical tools as the mother language teachers. And of course, that includes speaking. I know people used to do this like 50 years ago, right? Study French in high school and you couldn't speak 3 words, right? People tell me these stories here, and to an extent, I know this from my own family background. You know, my dad is in his mid-70s now, studied French in high school, but could not speak very well at all. But could write, of course, letters perfectly well in French. There was, yeah, different emphasis. But now, very common, of course, to include speaking and also writing in the language curriculum. So here in America, it's very, very normal to do that also with Latin. To the extent, of course, that a teacher can do it, and increasingly teachers can. Of course, many of them have gone to the University of Kentucky to learn that. Here's the 4 things that you need really to learn a language. Listening, I think in order of natural sort of events, right? Listening first. Speaking, I think, often comes before reading. Reading, and finally writing, maybe. Take one of these 4 elements away, can still be done, but less good. Take 2 away, you get into some difficulty, right? Take 3 away, you don't really learn the language, if I may use strong words. I know this because I was taught Latin and Greek myself by only reading in high school. Very good high school, very good teachers, some of them taught at university as well, and we learned a lot, but not really fluency. Reading only, there it is, that means for classics, translating, does not really provide, it sounds crude, but it's true, sufficient fluency to read the amount of literature that people study in the modern languages. All right? I'm not going to give you numbers, but anybody knows that if you're in graduate school for, say, French or Italian, you read novel after novel, book after book, endless amounts of poetry. German, I'm sure, too. Most classicists will have to admit that this is simply not the case for Latin or Greek. You just don't read that kind of amount because it's too difficult. And I think that just means we have to improve on the fluency. Number 3, threatened language, saving a threatened language. The knowledge of Latin is in decline, right? There's no doubt about it. The question is when it started. In the 1950s, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Look, 100 years ago, people writing about this already said it was in decline, right? So is it 200 years? Is it since the Renaissance, since the time of Thomas More and Erasmus, 1500? Is it since the fall of the Roman Empire, 500? Or is it since Tacitus that we're in decline? I don't know, but it's not getting better, right? This has to be turned around. You may think this is many, or you may think this is very few. I asked my 2 professors, specialists in this field, independently, how many good speakers they thought there were of the Latin language. And one was very optimistic about this, for all kinds of good reasons. And I said, well, come on, 1,000? He said, maybe not 1,000. The other one said, I said, look, come on, how many do you think there are? 20, 100, 5 million? She says, look, not more, non plus quinqua vinta. Not more than 50. Of course, depends on your definition of good, but it's not on good. So I think if we want to do something about it, if we want this language that has been so incredibly important, so incredibly influential, then maybe we should do something about it and start speaking. Is Latin a dead language? Well, I'm not going to answer that straight out, but I'll give you a few thoughts. Latin has been called the most influential language of all time. Now that sounds a little bit imperialistic, right? You say, well, how about Mandarin, you know, the language of the Incas? I don't know, but when you think about it, this must somehow be true. I mean, look at how much influence on other languages Latin had, add up all those speakers. I mean, it's rather mind-blowing. Then Latin was the lingua franca of the Western world, of course, for the 2,000 years or 1,000 years, a long time. And because of its place in Western culture, I think it's fair to say that if you want to study Western history, there's no way you do it without Latin. Not really, right? If history matters, Western history, then Latin matters. Until the Second World War, in many countries, dissertations continued to be written in good Latin. Classic dissertations, I'm aware of those in the Netherlands, very fine, still quoted now, but in a country like Hungary, also in other fields. Finally, Robert Graves. Who is Robert Graves? I, Claudius, right? And Alexander Leonard, who translated Winnie the Pooh into Latin. The two of them corresponded in Latin. I want to see that correspondence sometime. It must be somewhere, but. So what I'm saying is, I don't think Latin is so terribly dead. If I may quote a jazz scholar talking about the jazz in the 70s, it's not really dead, it only smells fun. Speaking plus writing is active Latin, okay? You need the two, in addition, of course, to reading and listening. Now, speaking Latin is now so rare, unfortunately, in the standard curriculum, that often teachers, when they let students read out sentences from time to time, say, well, we do active Latin, we do spoken Latin in class because we read it aloud. And that's not quite exactly what I mean. It's a very good beginning, and look, we did that in high school too, you know, read the sentence virtually, you have no clue what it means, and then you plow through it with the dictionary and the grammar, right? So speaking Latin is incredibly rare, unfortunately. Could be, writing Latin, if it is taught at all, is almost always, I apologize for myself, is almost always limited to translating usually very artificial sentences from English into Latin, right, or from German, depending on your language. And very often such translation sentences were translated from Latin into English first. Now you're going to translate them back, right? That is not really what I think most modern language teachers would consider composition, writing, right? So actual Latin composition, very rare today. Listening, hearing Latin is at best limited usually to hearing a teacher read some occasional Latin in class. And even that is often not the case. Very often learning Latin means teacher reads Latin with his eyes, but there he goes in English right away, or she, right? So there is a tendency to turn Latin into English all the time, or to your other language of communication. That is, I think, a pity, because it seems like you're almost all the time saying that Latin is not really good enough. You have to turn it into English all the time. Rather than sort of trying to enjoy the sound and the feel of Latin and trying to take it on its own terms. Oh yeah, I heard this on the radio a while ago. This big-time classics professor from, I think, Oxford or Cambridge, saying that it was so great that when you studied Latin, you didn't have to speak it, because she had to learn French in school and she had to learn how to speak it and she hated it. Now Latin was great because you didn't have to speak it. And I'm in the car and I want to sort of do this in the car, but I didn't, right? But, well, to me that's the world upside down, right? Those students, you know, we all know, teachers, some students are a bit sort of hesitant to speak, well, anything in class, any language, even English, and many of them are a bit maybe scared to try to say something in a different language. But the thing is, to sort of buy into that, I think is making the problem worse. You have to encourage them to speak in their own language, and maybe in another language as well. And yeah, my experience has been over the years that by far most students, all ages, love to speak in that new language. It's so cool. And I think Latin maybe even more than Spanish, Italian, French, German, because it is this mysterious sort of language that nobody speaks, right? So it's even more exclusive. Iterum dico, if you really love a language, you want to speak it as well as read it. I say it again, right? Iterum dico. Now here's a different scenario, right? And this is what we do, believe it or not, in Kentucky, of all places at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. We read Latin literature from any period, not just Virgil and Cicero, although we do that too. And we just discuss it, prepared, sometimes unprepared, in Latin, in class, right? In Latin. We hear our professors communicate with each other in correct, idiomatic, and elegant Latin on a daily basis. Okay, this is my judgment. I'm not saying I'm better than that, but it sounds pretty good, all right? And everybody says so. We hear not only the teachers, but also fellow students read Latin all the time, and in a variety of pronunciation systems. I'm letting this go now, but correct Latin pronunciation in a way does not exist. It's nothing to worry about. You can try to go with the classical thing, but people who do, there's all kinds of compromises. What people call ecclesiastical pronunciation, Italian pronunciation, perfectly fine. If it is good enough for Erasmus and Thomas More, it's certainly good enough for us, right? It's a matter of choice, is what I'm saying. We write essays in Latin about Latin literature in the context of world literature, right? And this leads to very interesting experiences. We read and chat with fellow students and teachers in Latin. And we have conversations about everyday topics in Latin, even in noisy Kentucky cafes. Here we are, the 8 of us or something, having dinner and chatting in Latin away. And finally the table next to us leaves, and somebody says, "What language are you speaking?" I said, "Look, we speak classical Latin." "Oh, really?" Okay, now, enough is enough, right? I've spoken enough English now. Let's see if you can get some Latin going. Is that alright? Because I can talk about this, you know, till the cows come home, but it doesn't mean anything, right? This I do just because it's so standard greeting in Latin. Salvete Domini Dominaeque. That's what I'm saying, right? Salvete Domini et Dominae. Ladies and gentlemen, right? And then if you want to say this back to me, you could just say Salve Domine. I'm not the domina, of course. If you were kids, I could say Salvete Puri Purique. Right? Or to your students in class, Salvete Discipuli Discipulaique. Right? The discipuli would of course include the girls, but you might as well make it explicit, right? Discipuli Discipulaique. And then they can learn how to say back to me. Yeah, or if I was a woman, I guess. Okay, now, this is a very popular one. Armadale in Australia est, no? Brisbane quoque in Australia est. Etiam Sydney est in Australia. These are official attested names. I didn't make them up. I think we should make up a Latin name for Armadale, but yeah, I thought about it, but let's not worry about it. Okay. Roma autem non est in Australia. Right? Who would disagree? Ubi est Roma? It's a Roman It's like, I used to teach music a lot, both in America and Australia, still do sometimes. And years ago I taught a course about Puccini, and somehow in Fairfield, Connecticut, and somehow we talked about Naples. And this guy says, "You mean Naples in Florida?" Okay, here we go. Ubi est Canberra? Canberra in Australia. Ubi est Brundisium? Do you know this? In Italia, yeah, Brindisi. Ubi est Berolinum? This is for German. In Germania est. Et ubi est Lutetia? Non est. In Gallia est, ida. In Francia est. In Gallia est, ida. Lutetia Parisi digitur. Lutetia est caput Galliae. Non est? Capital France. Thanks. En nou, ubi est Rotterdam?
In Nederland.
In Hollandia, in Nederlandia est. In Batavia est. In Batavia est. Yeah. Of course, the birth city of Erasmus, allegedly. And finally, ubi est Lexingtonia?
In America.
In America est. In Kentuckia Divitate. Yes. Okay, there we go. Novum Castellum est magnum opidum in Australia.
Anglia Corporate.
Ita, quoque in Anglia. Ja, quoque in Italia. Ita. Ebor est parvum opidum in Australia. Imo parvus vicus est. Tam parvus est. Haarlemum, ubi egomet natus sum, est magnum opidum in Batavia, sed non tam magnum quam Novum Castellum. Haarlem is quite a big city in Holland, but not as big as Newcastle. Right? Urala est parvum opidum Australianum, sed non tam parvum quam ego. Urala non est vicus. Mere simply. In my opinion, you cannot call it a village, right? It's a small town. All right? Yes. Okay. Okay, there we go. Quid est Dorigo? Opidum est in Australia. Quid est Ostia? In Italia est opidum in Italia proper Roma. Est ne magnum opidum? Parvum opidum est, fortasse. Sed in antiquity erat magnum opidum. Ja. Quid est Balkan? Parvum opidum est. Quid est Delphi? In Graecia est, ida. Est opidum in Graecia.
In Nova
And finally, quid est Hierosolyma? In Judea, ida, est caput Judaeorum, ida. Ja, Jerusalem. Jerusalem. Roma non est opidum. Roma est urbs magna. Urbs est magnum opidum. That leads to the question, quid est Sydney? Urbs in
Australia.
ja. Est ne parva urbs? Magna urbs est, ida. Eboracum est opidum Romanum in Britannia. Novum Eboracum est magna urbs Americana. Novum Eboracum quoque magnum malum digitur. Magnum malum.
Big Apple.
Ita! The Big Apple. Novum Eboracum is New York. Eboracum, of course, is York. Haarlemum in Batavia non solum opidum Batavum est, sed etiam pars novi Eboraci. Non est? Haarlemum est opidum in Batavia, sed Haarlemum quoque est pars novi Eboraci. It's part of New York. Quid est Mons Regalis? Bene. Est opidum, magnum opidum, nonne? In Canada. Quid est Bellingham?
Parvum opidum.
Parvum non est magnum opidum, nonne? In Australia. Quid est Lutetia? Est nog opidum? Na, urbs est, nonne? Urbs in Quaternum. In Gallia. Britannia est magna insula in Oceano Atlanticum. Satis magna est. Naxos est parva insula in Graecia. Tahiti est magna insula ut in Oceano Pacifico. Insula Pascalis.
Easter Island.
Easter Island. As Parva Insula un puto in Oceano Pacifico, I think. Which is Australia. This leads to controversy. I got myself in trouble about this before. Some people don't think it's an island. But Insula Magna est, Insula Maxima est in Oceano. Which is Creta. Ja, Insula in Graecia est. Dus non tan magna est, dus Insula Parma.
In mare Mediterraneo?
In Mare Nostrum.
Nostrum. Is that what they call it?
In Mare Nostrum, yeah, our sea.
I see.
Dit is Mona. Mona Anglican man. Parva Insula est in Oceano Atlantico. Et quid is Sicilia? Ita est Insula Italica, no?
In Nostrum.
In in Italia. And Italia, Proper Britannia, Ita is Insula Satis Magna, Proper Britannia, Ireland. Fluvii. Tiberis est Fluvius Satis Parvus. No Fluvius Magnus est. Ubi est Tiberis? In Italia and Roma, Ita. Renus, Fluvius Magnus est. Ubi est Renus? In Germania et Ita, optime dixisti, gratis studiago domine. Quid est Amazdor?
In Brazil.
Fluvius Ingens. Magnus Fluvius est. Ubi est?
In Brazil.
In Brasilia, in America, civis, et quid est Mississippi? Proper Fluvius Magnus est in America septentrionali. Amazon est in America meridionali. Quid est Tamesis?
Fluvius in
Ita in Anglia, in Britannia, Ita. Est ne Magnus Fluvius? Non tam Magnus, Bruder. Satis Magnus, Ita. Et quid est Rhonanus?
In Gallia.
In Gallia, Ita, Rhone, right? Fluvius Rhone. Es Magnus Fluvius, man. Magnus Fluvius est? Ita. Et quid est Danubius? In Austria, in Germania, Ita. Es Maximus Fluvius et Ecce Titulus Carminis in Ripa Danuvii Pulcherni Caerulegi. It is Carmen Kellepper, Johannes Strauss. On the shore of the Danube, very pretty and blue. This is a very famous waltz for the non-musicians, other musicians. Okay, now, it's often said there is no such thing as holiday Latin, right? Which of course, that is in a way fair enough. You know, sometimes people think that if you want to speak Latin fluently, you have to go to Vatican City, and then the waitresses will speak Latin with you, right? This is not really true, but this is mythology, right? Urban myth. To the extent of my knowledge, there's no place where you can go and really order coffee in Latin. Except maybe if one of us graduate students got a side gig in the cafeteria at the University of Kentucky, then maybe, right? But you can still make it up. It's still fun to think about it, right? For example, in Urbe tibi ignota, in a city that you don't know, ubinamst quaeso, raedae longae statio proxima. Ubinam est, ubi est, ubinamst quaeso, raedae longae statio proxima.
Where's the train station?
No, train station said Raida. Ida. Raida Lunga. Ida. So where's the next bus stop, please? Ubi nam. Nam is emphatic for ubi. Where? Where on earth, please? Here's the next bus stop. Time for walking, I suppose, like in Rome. And in Popina, in the pub, mihi affer. Quaeso.
Copy.
Poculum Cotionis Arabicae Amago Te. That's I love you, but it really means please, right?
Yeah.
Can I have a cup of coffee, right? Quick.
Ethiopica?
Quick.
Portion is Ethiopica.
Hier tas CV's, wel, Quoque extract, Portio, Japonica. Right? Tea, of course. I learned about this, the Portio Arabica thing and Portio Japonica seems to have been coined in the Neo-Latin by potentially the best Neo-Latinists alive, a man called Dirk Sacré in Belgium. The word cafeum and also cafea exists, it's used, but Latinists who speak the language are often not quite happy with borrowing words from the mother languages, but they try to find a way of saying it in proper classical Latin. And then you get things like Portio Arabica for coffee. And I must say I found it very elegant and nice. And if you want to flirt in Latin, you can, for example, say Quam pulcri sunt oculi. And that's of course a very mild, but you can just Quam pulcri. Okay. Now, okay. But I don't have time. What's the time? How many minutes? Oh, okay. Can I go over or not?
Yeah, you've got about 10 or 15 minutes tops.
Okay. Okay, so here's what I want to show you, if possible, is how you can use spoken Latin to teach literature. Right? Why not? And this is a famous little poem that I've taught in Latin before, so I've got some experience. Quintus est puer. Okay, Quintus, the name Quintus has nothing to do with 5, it's just a name. Quintus est puer. Thais est puella. Puer, puella. Okay, boy girl. Puer, puella, amat. Nothing unusual. That's happened, right? Puer, puella, amat. Quintus, taida, amat. Okay, taida is a Greek accusative. You don't worry about it, right? It's an accusative. Quintus, taida, amat. And you can turn it around, right? Taida, Quintus, amat. It's still him doing it, right? Quintus, taida, amat. She doubtlessly also loves him, but we don't worry about it. Okay, the question is, what about these two freaks? Thais unum tantum oculum habet. Thais habet unum oculum. Puella unum tantum oculum habet. Misella non duos oculos. Qui unum oculum tantum habet, non duos oculos, luscus est. Puella quae unum oculum tantum habet, lusca dicitur. Lusca. Quintus taida amat, Thais lusca est, Quintus puellam luscam amat. She could still have qualities, right? Okay. Quintus taida amat, taida Quintus amat, quam taida amat Quintus, taida luscam amat. Which one? Puer, qui puellam luscam amat, si dubio, oculos amat. Qui puer amat puellam luscam, nemo puellas luscas amat, sed Quintus puellam luscam amat, ergo Quintus nulos oculos habet. Thais unum oculum non habet, Quintus duos oculos non habet. And here's the poem. Taida Quintus amat, quam taida, taida luscam. Thais unum oculum non habet, ille Quintus duos oculos non habet. And here's even more the poem. Taida Quintus amat, quam taida, taida luscam. Un oculum Thais non habet, ille duos non habet. Is there anybody who does not understand this? Where's the guts to occur? He loves this girl who's only one eye.
What's your skin?
One eye. So if he loves this chick with only one eye, surely he must be blind. Right? But I apologize because it's of course quite advanced work we're doing here. But most people seem to get it, right, from the laughter judging. Yes? Yeah? Okay, anyway, you get the idea. If you have half a year, one semester of Latin, this can be done perfectly well in all Latin. And students do get it. Okay, there we go. Quis amat. So who's laughing? Quis amat.
Quintus.
Quintus amat. Quem amat Quintus? Taida amat ita. Quam taida amat Quintus? Taida luscam ita. And Thais quod oculos habet. Unum oculum habet, not Thais. Quod oculos habet Quintus? Nullos oculos habet. Gratias vobis ago. Finally, here's a little quote from a very interesting book that I read many years ago. And I realized that you could substitute Latin for the language the book is about. If literary Latin, refined, subtle, and plastic, is to be saved, how can it be done? And what is realistic, given where we are, rather than where we should have been? Secular, literary Latin can be saved, not secular as opposed, of course, to church Latin, all right? Not as physical society with streets and squares, but as a virtual network of small, serious islands of culture and creativity in the internet age. It strikes me so that it's so fitting for Latin, but the book is not about Latin. Latin is alive when a Latin literature seminar or some course is conducted in Latin. This, ladies and gentlemen, happens in Lexington, Kentucky all the time. Has been for 10, 15 years by now. With students who write their papers in Latin, I have done this, and discuss their work in Latin, and we do it all the time. It can even be alive in a city apartment in Armadale or a forest hut, when an individual writes or thinks in a language. It is alive when a worthy piece of writing is created in whatever genre, maybe including writing crosswords for students. This is what I do and love. It is alive when Latin letters and texts are exchanged by email. I emailed with a fellow student this morning in Kentucky in Latin, and I emailed with 2 professors independently in Latin the other day. And it gets easier, irrespective of where the correspondents happen to be living. And then I think comes the title of the book. You want to take a guess which language the book's about? I substituted Latin for the other language.
French? French?
No.
Esperanto?
No.
Greek?
No.
English?
No.
Farsi?
Arabic?
Yiddish.
Bien étonné, as we say, de se trouver ensemble. Latin and Yiddish. Quite a few parallels, right? All right. But I thought it was so appropriate. And I think this is very, very, very true. We cannot turn Europe into a Latin-speaking continent again. I don't think we should want that. But I think collectively, all over the world, we can help Latin stay alive. And teach young kids, and elderly kids maybe, a fantastic language, magnificently beautiful and fascinating language with an enormous literature, not just a little bit, but enormous literature, fascinating in fun ways and in more thorough ways. That makes it easier to read lots. That gives scholars access easily to thousands of years of history and so on. So I say, gratias vobis ago, and as in Latin gratias vobis ago. Sorry for going off of time.
We haven't run out of time for questions, so thank you so much for a very interesting lecture on the merits of teaching Latin, learning Latin and speaking Latin. You've been quite persuasive on that score. Are there any questions for Jan-Piet? Yes, Hannah.
Thanks very much for a fascinating conversation, Jan-Piet. Just a question with sort of neo-Latin, especially everyday Latin. There's bound to be a degree of artificiality to it because, you know, for example, this thing, and I don't know whether you know the Latin word for a mobile, it doesn't matter, it's something or other. But of course, whether it's you or some eminent professor saying, say, tabulam rasa or something, there's no guarantee, and this might be a funny word then, there's no guarantee that if Caesar or Cicero had invented the telephone or the mobile, that they would have used the same word, because, for example, no one would ever guess that the German word for this hand device is called das Handy. You know, you would put some long German word. No. So I would feel a bit funny having breakfast, you know, and my handy rings while I'm eating my cereal. How do I say that in Latin? Would not feel a bit that I'm just making it up rather than being in the time of Caesar or others?
I mean, that's I think, a fair enough observation. In the same way, you might say, if Molière had seen that instrument, he might call it differently than French call it now, right?
Sure.
So I think there is that Latin, in my view, is not significantly different in this respect than other languages are. It's just you have to come up with new terms in French, German, Italian, Chinese, Japanese, Australian, and in Latin also. No, it's at best Latinists will smile at these things and creatively come up with words, sometimes funny, sometimes handy, sometimes easy. We tend not to worry too much about it. It's in the whole scala of things a relatively small item. It's not a huge deal.
Yes, Jane.
I just wanted to thank you. That was absolutely terrific and great fun to be in school again and having a go. I just wanted to pick up your list of you had Erasmus and so on, all those.
Oh, yeah.
I just want to make a few points. The French Neo-Latin 16th century poets like Maurice Serre, who was called Doctors, he was very learned. And we've got Petrarch.
Yeah, Petrarch, of course. Oh, yes.
So we've got a whole lot of fabulous Neo-Latinists.
Tons.
And I was going to say, just make note, and you talked about Erasmus's nephew, with old Uncle Erasmus. Montaigne also only spoke Latin till he was about 10.
Montaigne famously was a native speaker.
Yeah.
Right? He was, yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say the agrégation. You mentioned exams having to be done and theses written in Latin. The French agrégation, doing it in your own language, had to be written into Latin until reasonably recently.
Yeah.
Just one other point too, you've probably heard of Yasmin Haskell in Perth, foundation chair by the Casamarca Bank of Italy of Latin humanism.
Fantastic.
So wonderful. And
Okay.
in fact, their comment is the greatest capital in the world is culture.
Yeah.
So that's a terrific thing. So,
Thank you very much for that.
Okay, yeah.
Tristan.
Yes. We've heard a couple of times to correct an idiomatic classical Latin.
Yeah.
How do you go about retrieving the spoken language when
Yep.
what we largely have is
In essence, we don't worry about it. I didn't say classical, but idiomatic and correct. And when speaking Latin, people do various things. I mean, the best Latin speakers emulate, I think it's fair to say, Ciceronian Latin. Most of us don't get quite there, all right? In general, I think what we try to do is connect with the spoken Latin that is closer to us in history. And I'm thinking Erasmus, Moore, and later. Partly also because everyday words, very often that we still use, originate in about that time, late Middle Ages. And at late Petrarch and Erasmus, you get a revival of relatively classical Latin, as opposed to medieval Latin, which arguably you could say is a little bit, maybe not quite so good or not so cool idiomatically. So that is basically what we, I think, try to do when coining new words. Depending on your point of view, you can try to go back to antiquity, and I think that's basically a normal endeavor. Sometimes you simply use a word that people like Erasmus and Thomas More used. There's a variety. It's all these things are small footnotes for me in an overall endeavor of trying to express yourself in some Latin. Is that? Yeah. An example, a quick example is, for example, for yes. I tend to use ita. Many colleagues use seek. Seek is not wrong, but it has a bit of a late Latin flavor. So, if you're classical, then ita is maybe more correct. But seek is not wrong, obviously. It's one example.
Jenny.
I was going to say that, coming back to Herman's point, that if you're going to keep a language alive, then inevitably you're going to have new words.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's still a dead language. And also, I mean, for that very phone, the Americans and Australians and English have come up with different words for a mobile phone, like a cell phone and a mobile phone. The other, just another quick point, you said the best Latin speakers, the very best, will be speaking Ciceronian Latin, maybe.
Close to it, yeah.
Yeah, I remember my Latin teacher at school famously, well, to us, said, and the people in the forum used to listen to Cicero with their mouths open, waiting for the main verb. So how would you have a conversation in Ciceronian Latin? It would be a very long speeches between...
in the extreme, yes. There is still a difference between written language and spoken language. And Tristan is very, very much right that we know not very much about spoken Latin around the year zero, so to speak. That's a problem. There is more and more research into this, and you can say something about it. We can even say some things about the pronunciation system. But it's very difficult. Partly also we will talk about a big geographical area and a big historical area, centuries long. So it's very difficult to say very many definite things about that.
But presumably they would have spoken with Cicero's grammar and grammar and vocabulary, but not his oratorial style. Otherwise,
yes, and maybe to an extent not quite the same vocabulary, and maybe also not quite the same grammatical conventions.
Yes.
For example, things like the indirect speech with the accusative and infinitive, as opposed to using quod, that, which we now consider a late Latin sort of vice. It looks like that existed much earlier in lower class sort of Latin, but people like Cicero and Caesar considered it low class. But it existed, yes. Oh, sorry.
Jan-Piet, take your comments too about how to get it going and keep it going. We are using this with at least 3 New South Wales Aboriginal languages. With a bunch of young people, I'm encouraging them email, talk what they can, and so on, and the same with people working with Kumbanga and Gummerandrai. So that is the way to go these days.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Apart from moving to Kentucky, how can you do this?
Oh, we'll have coffee later if you like. We'll have coffee later if you like. There's a ton of things you can do. There's books I can recommend to you that encourage this way of learning. I'd be very, very happy to help in any possible way I can. If some university would want to employ me to teach Latin.
Just a couple of weeks ago, I picked up a little item in my news aggregator on the iPhone, and it said that recently in the Vatican they'd instituted a Latin tweet.
Oh yes.
And it was generating so much, 100,000 I think they nominated, more than French or German number of hits with the Latin tweet.
Yeah, I'm aware of it. I've not seen it. It's a big thing, and we in Kentucky wish that the Vatican would do even better things to preserve Latin.
Chris.
Are you aware that you can get Asterix comics in Latin?
Yes, I have all the good ones. I'm considering writing something about it. They're a lot of fun.
Greek is started much earlier than Latin. Much earlier.
It depends how you look at it, but yes, maybe.
Yeah, we can talk about this actually before. And it's still going on, okay? Latin moved into, or evolved into Spanish, French, other languages. Okay? So languages keep on changing all the time, all kind of direction, always. But how can you explain the difference between the evolution of the Greek and the evolution of Latin?
Well, it's a very complex question. I mean, I would argue that, grosso modo, Latin has stayed alive. So you're right that Latin moved into the modern languages, Romance languages, but Latin stayed alive as well. Right? There were these two streams. Well, you can look at it that way, but if in the 17th century a Latin 700-page novel or something can go through 55 editions, that means it was not such a small number of people who could read that, right? And this is not so easy Latin. Greek moved into later Byzantine Greek and then into modern Greek, right? Ancient Greek. There are some efforts here and there to speak Attic, all right, and Koine also, New Testament Greek. This compared to Latin is a relatively small thing. It's a small thing. Koine is a bit easier than Attic, I suppose, to learn how to speak. Not so easy either, and a lot more complex because everyday words in ancient Greek we really don't have, because the language was not used for so many years. In Latin, very many common everyday words we do have because it was always used, right? So that's the problem with Latin, with Greek as opposed to Latin. What I always say about the choice of Greek and Latin, say a kid, 12-year-old kid, 14-year-old kid, what language should I learn? Well, first learn a normal mother languages, you know, Italian, French, Japanese or something. Then if you really like it and you want to do classical language, Latin, I would say, is your passport for European history. If you are into antiquity, into really cool literature, forget Latin and do Greek right away. Because you want to compare Virgil and Homer, but it's nothing else. All right? Sallust and Thucydides, look, it's no comparison. Both cool, but and we're not even talking tragedy. Okay, Roman tragedy is a tragedy. Greek tragedy is really good. There's also, interestingly, vastly more Greek literature from antiquity that we have than Latin. That's because it's so good. It was dead for many years, Greek, right? It was not done at all, studied in Europe. And still we have so much more Greek literature than Latin. So, if you want to learn about the cradle of civilization, and you have to pick one of the two, I'd say Greek. But Latin is fantastic for the later history, absolutely.
That's all right. The lady behind the camera.
I was going to ask, but it's been covered a bit, I was going to ask when you thought of people who were speaking Latin fluently now, were you including people in Vatican City who I assume, because they write Latin, also speak it sometimes?
Some of them write Latin and they need very finely trained classicists to correct their Latin. And one of those former correctors is one of my teachers. And she said she couldn't believe what she saw there. I asked another teacher a while ago, where are the best Latin teachers? And I asked, perhaps